My name is Brandon Savage. I am the Multifam track chair, so you'll get a chance to hear from me each day. I also am the principal at a consulting company called CXPro, focuses on customer experience. At K-State University, I teach in the business school. I teach operations and supply chain and business presentation skills. I'm excited to be here today to lead our discussion with our guest, Nick Agopian, who's the VP of Sales and Marketing at Renewaire. And I'm going to turn the time over to him to tell us a little bit more about himself, about his company, and then he's got a little kind of beginning exercise he's going to share with us, kind of a thought experiment.
Thank you so much. As Brandon mentioned, my name is Nick Agopian. A little bit about me. I attended McGill University as well as Vanier College in Montreal, focused specifically on building systems engineering. In Montreal, we have a couple of universities that don't just teach mechanical engineering, but specifically everything associated to buildings. So besides the thermodynamics and all the other typical engineering classes, we would take piping, fire protection, ventilation, duct design, cooling load calculations, heating load calculations, and so on and so forth. So at the end of that, you're pretty much just pigeonholed into the building industry. After that, I tell people I went through a midlife crisis about 5 years ago where I ended up going back to school to complete my graduate work, and I did that at Duke University. Probably the hardest thing I've ever done. But well worth the time. I called it my brain reboot. So speaking of brain reboots, we can always learn something. You know, what I'd like to do today is have an open mind. We talked about being flexible. We don't know what we don't know, so just a little bit of trivia. If I was to ask everybody here, what does the Amazon rainforest do for us? And the answer would be, well, it provides us oxygen. How many people would say that? Do you all agree? That's what it's there for? Actually, it's not the oxygen per se. What if I was to tell you that all the oxygen that the rainforest produces is consumed by the animals in the rainforest? Because that's what's actually happening. What the rainforest does for us is essentially the trees wick up the water from the ground, moves through the trunk, goes into the branches, into the leaves, and then evaporates into the air. Then we form clouds. Those clouds move along and hit the Andes and then precipitate, and that's where we have the rain across the Andes. As the rain hits the Andes, it picks up nutrients from the rocks and ends up in the ocean. And actually, the oxygen we breathe comes from these little things called diatoms. So while we thought the oxygen came from the rainforest, it didn't, but the rainforest definitely has something to do with that. So a little bit of learning to say, you know what, sometimes we think we might know something, but you know, maybe it's not 100% accurate. A little bit of trivia here, because we're going to be talking about the built environment, specifically the shared environment that we have, just like we are in this room. Can anybody tell me how much water we drink daily?
Couple of
4 pounds. Yeah, a couple of them, exactly. We drink about 4 pounds of water daily. Can somebody tell me how much food we eat daily?
Probably too much.
For me, it's too much usually every day, but that's besides the point. And I don't drink water. I should be drinking more water. Anybody? 4 pounds. Can somebody tell me how much air we breathe daily? If someone's willing to do that and you come see me later upstairs, I'll give you a Yeti mug. Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Take a guess.
How much? Well, that's close, but no. You're going up, but 18 pounds wins it actually, because it's the closest. We breathe in 30 pounds of air a day. You know, what's really interesting is that when we take a look at the digestion process, it's developed over the millions of years. What's happened is you can eat something like in India, that, you know, Indian street food in the middle of Bombay, and you'll probably get a stomach ache, but your stomach will be able to fight against it, get rid of the impurities. Your kidneys, your whole process down here is very advanced. When it comes to our lungs, it is the one area that hasn't advanced throughout these millions of years. What we breathe in through our nose goes directly into our bloodstream. And that becomes very critical as we continue talking. And then when we take a look at water, there's an actual expiry date on this water. And we'll address water in a second, but water has been around for billions of years. Water can't be destroyed and water can't be created. And we'll address that in a second, but there is an expiry date on water. There's also an expiry date on food, but we don't have an expiry date on air or understanding the half-life of air, which we'll address in a second. So what we breathe in becomes very critical within the built environment.
So that brings us back around to the topic for today. So state-of-the-art health and wellness in multifamily homes. And everything in this track is all on multifamily homes. And we're going to focus today our conversation on three primary areas: air, water, and light.
When we look at the built environment or the shared environment, as we alluded to a second ago, you've got various different aspects that we need to look at. As a developer or a builder, it's going to be critical that we look at various different things, like we have ventilation, air quality, the temperature, the humidity. We'll address also water and light through this conversation. But why is this important? We didn't put in as much emphasis, if we go back 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, into things like temperature. We said you need to set a temperature and then live with that temperature. Well, air distribution now becomes very critical. How do you get that air into a space and outside the space? In a home, what if I was to tell you that science proves that when you're sitting at your couch or standing and cooking or whatever the case may be, the temperature difference between your toes and your nose, if there's more than a 3-degree delta between there, you experience discomfort. You experience anxiety. You are not feeling good. You don't have that feeling of better well-being, and that's a 3-degree temperature difference. And when you take a look at some of these homes, depending on what season that you're in, going from down here to where we are, let's say around here, around 5.5 feet, it's very easy to hit a 3-degree temperature difference. So air distribution becomes critical. So when we look at air quality, if we don't see it, we don't smell it, we don't touch it, we have a severe cognitive dissonance thinking that it's not there. We used to think that the macro impacts are what's critical, meaning that if a brick was to fall down on my finger, that's going to hurt because it's immediate. What we now know is that the nano impacts over a prolonged period of time has much worse effect on the physiological operation of the human body. Nothing against smokers, but it's like smoking. You know, you smoke, you have a cigarette, apparently I don't smoke, it feels good, especially when you wake up or when you have a meal. You don't feel the effects right then and there, but over a lifetime of smoking, then you end up with COPD. And that's when the impact starts to occur. And that's when you wish that maybe you didn't smoke back then, and you could have lived that extra 5 to 10 years when it becomes really critical for your children or your grandchildren. The same thing, exposure to volatile organic compounds or acid gases or particle matter, which we'll address in a second. But everything together is a system that gives you that good indoor air quality or that benefit within the shared environment or the built environment.
So one of the things that we've seen over the last 18 months, particularly when it comes to air, is a reaction to the SARS-CoV-2 virus that results in COVID-19 disease. And there's been a great focus in lots of areas, schools particularly. That's impacted both where I teach and where my children go to school, as I imagine it's impacted many of you. So as we begin our conversation here, air ventilation filtration certainly has a more robust and proven offerings in the space. So Nick, how specifically has COVID and SARS-CoV-2 drawn attention to the need for air filtration in multifamily environments?
That's really interesting. Deficient indoor air quality, or the lack of indoor air quality within the space, has been around for many, many years. But today, because of SARS, and to be very specific, the problem is SARS-CoV-2. That's the virus. That's that little thing. It's that little round ball with the fur that's sticking out of it. That's what you're trying to control. COVID-19 is the disease that you get from exposure to SARS. So what we need to do is look at controlling the SARS virus. The SARS virus is very small, and it's the equivalent to size as PM 2.5, which we'll talk about in a second. PM 2.5 is particle matter 2.5 micron. The SARS virus, as I said, is kind of like that brick that's hit you, but the indoor air quality is vast. It's gases, it's particulates, it's fumes, it's everything we do indoors. If you go back 10 years ago or 15, 20 years ago, we used to think that, oh, it's the builders. The builders are using poor materials, so they're off-gassing, and that's what's causing deficient indoor air quality. It has nothing to do with the builders, because the builders actually do use good quality products. It's the occupants, and it's everything we do indoors. So what can we do? All cognizant authorities are recommending ventilation, 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 which is true. So open your windows. We did that because it's the summertime. But what do we do in January if you're in Minnesota? You can't open the window. What do you do when you're in Miami in the middle of July? You can't open the window. So you have to ventilate, and we'll talk a little bit about energy recovery ventilation in a second. In addition to that, ventilation, while it lowers the concentration, you're able to lower potential exposure. I'm sure some of you didn't get COVID. Once again, the disease. Have you been exposed to SARS? I guarantee you, every single one of you have been exposed to SARS, without a doubt. The question is, has your body been able to fight it off? And the answer is yes. Why? Either because the space was ventilated, or the space was filtered, because you were able to lower the concentration to the point where your body can fight it off. Now, let's say you had a very high concentration. The ventilation was poor, they didn't have adequate filtration. So now your body was bombarded with a higher concentration of the SARS virus. At that point, it's sitting in your throat, your body's trying to fight it off, it can't, and now it starts incubating, and then it grows. Then you end up with the symptoms. The problem is if you can't keep fighting it off and it ends up in your lungs, now you end up in the hospital. But ventilation and filtration in concert with each other becomes very critical to, once again, controlling the concentration of the SARS virus so that your body has enough time to be able to fight it off. But at the end of the day, no matter where you go, all cognizant authorities within the United States, cognizant authorities within Europe, all recommend that minimum ventilation has to be up to par. More importantly, increased ventilation just lowers that concentration even further. And then adding MERV 13 filtration gives you what you need in order to properly protect people, whether it's in homes or anywhere else we may be, such as this here.
How does that take place when you've got existing building that maybe doesn't have enough ventilation? What's being done to mitigate those existing buildings, and then what are you seeing as we move forward to new buildings to make sure there's proper ventilation?
That's an excellent question. In existing buildings, you have a certain amount of heating and cooling, and that's fixed. So in order to increase the amount of outdoor air that goes through these systems, you have to look at energy recovery. There's numerous energy recovery systems that are in the market where you can take that stale indoor air that you've already paid for to cool and heat and dehumidify and humidify, recapture the energy to as much as 70%, throw that air out, bring that clean outdoor air, and then temper that outdoor air so that when it hits your existing HVAC system, it's not compromised, meaning that your HVAC system can still maintain the temperatures indoors as needed. So for retrofit applications, you can increase the amount of outdoor air, and you have to do that with energy recovery. When it comes to filtration, I'll show you a slide a little later where increasing to MERV 13 filtration is not as bad as people think. People say, oh, my HVAC system won't be able to handle it, it's gonna have reduced airflow. And in actuality, the impact is less than 0.2 inches, but we'll talk about in a second. So it's actually very easy to modify that, existing buildings. When it comes to new buildings, a lot of developers are now saying, you know what? I don't want to go with code. When somebody says, I built to code, what you've said is, I've just built to the lowest possible standard that's out there so none of us go to jail. That's what that means. But a lot of developers and builders, like I was just working with somebody in New York City, And his engineer came to me and he said, my builder wants 3 times the recommended outdoor air into his condos. He's selling 600 square foot condos on Fifth Avenue for $3 million. So he needs a differentiating value proposition. And for him, that was very critical. And you'll see a little later why that's critical, because science shows us that ventilation becomes paramount, because we build these structures so tight now, which is really important, and we should continue that way, that method of construction. But at the end of the day, it's build it tight and ventilate it right. Ventilation is something that millennials, in fact, we have a post that's going to be going up on our website that talks specifically how millennials are demanding better indoor air quality. We live in a whole food society. We're very particular about what comes in through here. And now, because of SARS, we've become very particular what goes in through there. And people are willing to pay, and I can show you the research. Anything I cite here, I'm willing to give you the research on if you're interested. But people are willing to pay 38% higher rents and 38% higher dollar per square foot if it could be proven that that you all are providing better indoor air quality for the occupants indoors. When we look at the entire system, it's not a silver bullet. You can't say, well, I've got more ventilation, or, oh, I got filtration, or I'm using a filter on my LED lights, or I put in a reverse osmosis filter for my water. It isn't singular. It has to be a systems approach where you're controlling temperature, you're controlling humidity, you're controlling particulates, you're controlling the quality of water, and you're looking at the type of LED lights that you're putting in. It has to be a total systems approach, or else you'll never achieve the desired demand that we're going to get starting now moving forward, particularly from the millennials.
Makes sense. So as we look, what we've gone through for the past year and a half, with a higher focus on better air quality, what technology advancements do you see out in the next 2, 3, 5 years as a result? What's on the horizon?
So what's happening today is there's particular concern for pathogens, and we understand that pathogens are very harmful because we don't understand them. We don't understand how they work. So right now we are filtering them using MERV 13 filtration. How many people know what MERV 13 means compared to MERV 8? One person. Okay, this is really interesting. MERV 13 is a higher efficiency. MERV stands for minimum efficiency reported value. Now MERV 13 takes away the smaller particles than, let's say, a MERV 8, which is what you're typically putting in your HVAC systems. Now, something you have to be very careful about is there's a lot of marketing that's out there for electronic air cleaners. You got to be very careful on this stuff. UV light, they say, oh, we got to put in UV light, or we got to put in ionization equipment. Well, when you look at this kind of technology, we now know that electronic air cleaners produce ozone, some of them lower than others, which is fine, but they also produce something else that's not reported, and that's ROSs, reactive oxygenated species. This ionization, or these radicals that are out there, free radicals such as hydroxyl radicals and so on and so forth, do affect the pathogens that are in the air. But if I was to tell you all, what is the one thing doctors are doing less today? And that's prescribing antibiotics, because we've overprescribed them. Because all we've done is just made the microbes stronger and stronger. If you think we are going to win against the pathogen war, we're not. So by putting in these kind of systems, you're killing everything in the air. Just like when you take an antibiotic, you kill everything that's in your system. So you got to start eating a little bit of yogurt and try to build up your process. We are biodomes. Everything here, this room is a biodome. Each individual person actually has a biodome. And what's interesting, I was reading some research about 2 months ago that it's as particular as your fingerprint and your eyes and your retina. Each one of us has a biodome that's very specific. There are good and there are bad pathogens or microbes in the air. By putting in electronic air cleaners or UV light, you kill everything. That's not good. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of cognizant authorities like the CDC are saying, hey, take your stale air, throw it out, and allow Mother Nature to do what she has to do with that air and the contaminants within that air, and bring in fresh, clean outdoor air. And the EPA has proved that outdoor air is 5 times to as much as 100 times cleaner than indoor air. Or you could reverse that and say indoor air is 5 times to 100 times dirtier than outdoor air. But we have a severe cognitive dissonance where we say, oh, when it's really hot outside, you come inside, you're protected. But once again, what you can't see, touch, smell, or feel, or whatever, you don't think is there, but is actually there. So just taking the air, throwing it out, bringing fresh outdoor air, bringing it in is much better because you maintain that biodome and not kill everything.
Okay, so as we look at ventilation, and I think you've touched on each of these 3 items so far about having freshness, humidity, and temperature. Let's talk a little bit, you got some numbers here, and I know you're not going to go too deep on this, but talking about ventilation and air changes per hour, and then looking at how that impacts benefits for those living in the home.
Okay, so when it comes to ventilation, as I said, there's minimum requirements, but nothing says that you can't go above that. Now, there are some energy codes, like the IECC, that you got to conform to. So the only way to do that is using energy recovery, where you're taking air and crisscrossing their paths with a membrane between them so there's no cross-contamination between the two of them, and you transfer the energy up to 70% from one side to the other. Now, as I said earlier, you don't have to necessarily go with the minimum. You can increase the amount of ventilation per person because it's critical to get up above the minimum that we had previously, because previously we're saying we need ventilation for oxygen purposes, especially because we seal these structures so tight. But today, we need ventilation for air changes. And the more you change the air in a space, the lower the concentration of pathogens, and the lower the concentrations of gases and particulates. Once again, I'll talk about particulates in a second. When we take a look at ventilation, what does this mean? And here's a depiction of what happens when a single person is speaking within 2 minutes, 15 minutes to 60 minutes. And you can see tremendous amount of buildup of particulates. What are those particulates? Fomite. There's fomite coming out of my mouth right now. Every time you speak, there's something that comes out of your mouth. And the fomite itself is what holds things like SARS as a pathogen. But over and above that, everything else, for the men out here, we off-gas acetone. The women know what that is. It's nail polish remover. Did you know that our bodies produce acetone? Amongst every other type of bioeffluent, which I'm sure you can imagine. So besides the fomite, besides everything else that we off-gas, the buildup of contaminants within the space becomes rather rapid when you don't have ventilation. And when you do have ventilation, keep going, you're able to maintain whatever you had within the spaces, which what we call steady state concentration. You'll always have a minimum level of something, but maintaining that minimum level is what's critical. Even as something like CO2. We used to think CO2 is a bioeffluent. It's inert. It's not a big thing. Well, NASA conducted some research about 8 years ago because the astronauts were making mistakes. They looked at the food, the clothes, their exercise, their sleeping habits. They looked at everything. And then they realized that the carbon dioxide level at 5,000 ppm was too high. We conducted further research here with Lawrence Berkeley, and we realized that cognitive decision-making abilities decline with concentrations that we are advocating today of 1,000 and 1,500 parts per million. When we sleep and we close the doors and some of these systems are turned off and you have zero air movement, your bedroom can go as high as 3,500 ppm. You put a dog in there, you're up at almost 5,000 ppm. The CO2 that you sleep in impacts your sleep habit and also impacts your productivity the next day. We can scientifically prove that there is cognitive decline. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to say 2 + 2 now doesn't equal 4. But if, let's say, in this building, there was a fire, and the manager was talking to the chief and said, okay, where are the people? How do I get my firemen and firewomen inside, and how do I get them out? And you have to start to think, you have cognitive decline. There's further research that shows that if you lower CO2 concentration from the typical 1,500 ppm to 750 ppm in schools, SAT scores are 18% higher. I tell people I could have been a straight A student. I blame it on CO2. But science shows that even a simple bioeffluent like CO2 has a negative impact. I'll just say one thing. I know we're getting late here, but
No, it's
you have reversible issues like dizziness and nausea and fatigue, but CO2 is an acid. And there's something called respiratory acidosis, and that attacks bone marrow. That's irreversible, and that's just CO2 today.
And this is what I think is top of mind for so many people over the last year and a half. I know like our local elementary schools, some rooms they couldn't have classes in, others they couldn't because they're looking at this changes per minute to make sure that the air is getting circulated out. So I would imagine for a lot of people now versus 2 years ago, this makes a lot more sense, and that people are wondering not only in their own where they're staying in a multifamily environment, they're concerned about what is the air exchange in my unit versus the units next to me, and is there any cross contamination? What's it like in the shared space? So these are much more top of mind for people now than it was 2 years ago, and can be a competitive advantage for a building that can say, hey, we're doing this. We're not only meeting the minimum, but this much ahead of it.
There's new code coming down the pipeline. We just disbanded the multifamily working group for ASHRAE Standard 62.2. We just completed all of our work and all of our research, and the recommendation has come down that compartmentalization is going to be critical in multifamily applications because of what you just said. Right now you have exhaust fans. So if you have a person who has their windows open, I'll be really dramatic here, and they're smoking crack in the condo or the apartment next to you, and in the one where you're at, you have an infant, and you're cooking, so you have your kitchen exhaust fan on, which is more powerful than a bathroom exhaust fan. But what ends up happening is air goes through that window, goes into that room where they're smoking crack. You know, I'm being very dramatic here, you know, but whatever, could be they're cooking ethnic foods or whatever the case may be, or cigarette smoking. But it will make its way, we know it's making its way into this other compartment. So compartmentalization using balanced ventilation is coming down the code cycles, and we'll probably see that within the next 2 years. And it's very critical because we can't even rely on the air that you put into the hallways that makes its way into each compartment if you just use bathroom exhaust fans. Because the half-life of air, when it goes through your ventilation system, your hallway ventilation system, it's picking up, depending on where you're at, because a high-rise is a very complex system. When you're down lower, you've got the garages. But then again, no matter where you're at, you've got garbage chutes, you've got the elevator shaft. And you know, in elevator shafts, you've got the elevators that are going up and down, and you've got bearings, and you've got rubber, and you've got the steel, and you've got grease. And the shaft is, you've got the elevator that's going through the shaft, and it's compressing the air, and it's pushing that air through the doors into the hallways. And now suddenly, all that air, which is supposedly your fresh air or your outdoor air, goes into the hallways and into each compartment. And we know we're not getting the proper ventilation, meaning that O2 molecule that you wanted right here at the breathing zone doesn't make its way there. So changes are coming down the pipeline, and compartmentalization is going to become very paramount. And once again, to go back to my friend on Fifth Avenue, he's looking at compartmentalization today, even though code says you don't need it, but once again, increasing the amount of outdoor air that's going through there because people will pay for it. We live in a whole food society, as I said a second ago. People will pay for a better environment, and I'll show you scientifically in a second why.
Okay, so we've covered the top row there. As we look at energy recovery ventilation, you've mentioned it a couple times. Let's dive into that just a little bit more detail. This is where you said the air is passing each other through a membrane, and energy is being exchanged so that you can be, you know, during the summer when you've got cool air inside, and you're now bringing in warm air, that because you're crossing them, you're able to recover some of that energy.
Correct. So technology today that we have is using membranes transfers both the sensible energy and the latent energy, essentially the heat and the moisture. And why is that important? Because you want to transfer the moisture that's coming in the middle of summer in Miami back to the exhaust air being thrown out, so you don't have to dehumidify as much as you would typically without it. Conversely, in the middle of winter, the moist hot air that you're throwing out transfers, of course, the heat and the humidity back into the outdoor air that's coming in, so you're maintaining a proper humidity level within the space. Why is that important? Because proper humidity control is very critical. You know your lips get dry when in the middle of winter, if let's say you're up north. Well, more than your lips get dry, your tongue, your palate, the roof of your mouth, your throat, all that dries up. And controlling the spread of the SARS virus within the wintertime becomes paramount when you humidify. If you don't humidify, the lack of moisture within your throat is what allowed the SARS virus to attack the body even further. Looking at these type of technologies becomes critical in maintaining that proper steady state condition within a space. And then when you do that, there is a payback. And the paybacks vary from as little as 18 months to maximum about 4 years. From that point on, these energy recovery devices are paying you back if you're operating the building, or paying back the space owner if they're controlling their own electrical costs or whatever the case may be. So installing ERVs are not a capital expense. If anything, they will pay you back and cost the operation of the building to be as close to zero as possible. So you've heard about net zero or the challenge 2030 that's coming down, where buildings are gonna technically be at zero energy. Without energy recovery, it's going to be almost impossible to achieve. What you see on the screen is something called DALI. It's Disability Adjusted Life Year. It was a 10-year study funded by the Gates Foundation, and it cost $12 million for this research. If you look at the little kid, you're born with a healthy life, then you have a red bar, that's an incident. You have a gray bar, which is your healthy life, then you have another red bar, another incident. You go through your adult life, and your healthy part of your life gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Today, we live with disability and die young. They looked at 75 different things: high blood pressure, high body mass index, low diet in fruits, alcohol use. I think I just described myself. But, and a whole bunch of other reasons. 2 of the top 10 reasons why we have this problem is because of deficient indoor air quality. And what you see from the Gates Foundation in table number 1 over there is, if you just go with base infiltration, you have a DALI last year number of 160, and I know I don't have the time to discuss this in detail, but it's at 160, all the way to unbalanced mechanical ventilation. This is what you do today with an exhaust fan. Then you have balanced mechanical ventilation, down to 70. That lower number means we can scientifically prove that you can increase your life and better your life by just putting in balanced ventilation. That's what Lawrence Berkeley deduced from the Gates Foundation. So taking this kind of data and presenting it to your building, I guess selling an entire building or selling a condo at why you have a differentiating value proposition becomes very compelling. Yes, we all want granite countertops, but how you ventilate and how you filter is 2 small little things. So what's better, a granite countertop for $10,000 or an energy recovery device and ventilation for $3,000? Because we can mathematically prove that you can increase your life and better your life through all of this science and research. Who knew that you can move particles through tissue? But it does. But just like cigarette smoking, we don't see the impacts on a day-to-day basis. It's like this. When is this going to become too heavy for me to hold? When are these nano impacts on things that we don't see, touch, or smell going to impact our lives? And that usually happens later on. And it's evident today, because for those of you who are as old as me, you remember you never wanted to sit beside a window or a door because of the draft. Well, those drafts were ventilation back then. It was uncomfortable, it was an energy hog, so we had to fix that. But by doing that, we stopped ventilating, and that's why codes are changing to increase ventilation rates in order to bring back that better indoor air quality.
So as we look at water, how can water delivery designs impact a resident's experience?
Okay. It's really interesting. Water is really critical, obviously. It's a foundation of life. As I said earlier, water can't be created or destroyed, and we're doing so much to conserve water, and it's good, and we do need to conserve water, but it's funny because water doesn't disappear. It's distributed unevenly across the world. But when it comes to your residence, what you're trying to do is improve water quality, but when you look at delivery designs, there are technologies out there that allow you to recirculate water within your piping system so that you're maintaining a constant temperature within your water pipe, particularly when it comes to hot water. I should address that. This is for hot water. So this way, I mean, how many of you in your spaces, you open up your water and you can kind of turn on your bath, walk away, brush your teeth, and come in and you got your hot water? Yep. Well, there are technologies out there that will allow you to maintain that water temperature, because the second you do that, that's where you're technically wasting water, but you're heating up that water within the pipe, allowing it to cool down, and then continuing that cycle. So by being able to recirculate that water and maintain that temperature of that water where you get instantaneous water, you're able to lower your heating energy costs. Another thing you should be looking at is filtration. You can buy a whole house water system for as little as $2. GE sells that product. It removes a lot of the impurities that are out there within water, lead, particles, and even chemicals. Now, why is that critical? It's critical because if you go to any Starbucks, what do you think their claim to fame is? Is it because they have better coffee? No. It's because they have a very elaborate water filtration system underneath those beautiful looking machines. So when it comes to water quality, it becomes really critical. And in fact, in that Dali study, water quality was up there in order improving lives, because you've got chlorines and fluorides that are in the water that need to be filtered out. It's important in order to, once again, control microbials and pathogens in our water, but it's not necessarily good for us. And I keep alluding to right back to how heavy is this thing? It's these nano impacts that are much more impactful over a lifetime. So I say to all of you, how critical is the last 10 years of your life? Because from people that I know, they would do anything to have even one extra year of their life at the time when they're at that point in their lives. Being able to give 5 or 10 years on how we live our lives today, well, it's very easy. Water and air quality.
And you likely have the same potential customers, the whole food customers you've been talking about, that if they care about the air, they're also very concerned about the water, what filtration is in place, that's coming out of the tap in my kitchen, the tap in my bathroom, potentially even the tap in the shower.
Exactly.
Okay, shifting to light. As we're focusing on light, and we're going to talk both natural light and artificial light. Let's start with artificial first. I've noticed, I've got teenagers in the house that they have all wanted to buy these little LED add-ons into their rooms, so they've got different colors, and I've joined in on them. I'm like, okay, I'll get some of these. So I've got some behind my TV, so I can do some mood lighting in our big room. We look at this color tunable lighting. What, besides it just looking cool, what are some of the more tangible benefits this can present to residents?
There's always something called causality. We do one thing, like we did, we're sealing our structure so tight that we have deficient indoor air quality because we're basically sealing in our juices, and that's why we have to ventilate and filter. We go to LED lighting because it's energy efficient, just like sealing our structures is energy efficient. It's a good thing, but you can't do one thing without having something else happen. And when it comes to LED lighting, it's energy efficient, it's fantastic, it's great. But if you're not filtering that LED light and controlling the blue light that comes out of your LED light, you are messing up with sleep habits, circadian rhythms, and what happens is not only are you messing up sleep habits, but you end up doing different things, and there's a lot of research, different things because you're not sleeping. You're eating later, you're eating poorly. And now there's research that shows, and there's research from the University of Toronto, from Harvard, various different places around the world, and the correlation is unbelievable that proves that obesity and cardiovascular issues are attributed to the blue light. Blue light is fantastic. or the blue wavelength in LED light is fantastic because you become more alert, you're awake, but if you have it at night, then at that point, you're not able to sleep, and it causes a whole bunch of other problems.
So it's figuring out the right time, the right light.
Or having adjustable LED lights. And then also, in your manuals, teaching your occupants how to use that light becomes very critical because it's the total engagement with that built environment that becomes critical on happiness or comfort within the space.
Natural lighting. What advancements are you seeing here?
How many people know about the Velux video, the indoor generation?
A few hands there.
Yeah, for all of you, please write this down. Go to, Velux is here. I urge you to Google Velux, the indoor generation, and watch that video. They've won awards because of that video. It's got millions of views. It's incredible. And it's all about natural light. Natural light becomes paramount. And if you speak to architects today, of course, when you come into a space like this, you have a very high ceiling because you have a feeling of better well-being as compared to a low ceiling. You know, when you build your condos, think about going into an 8-foot high ceiling in a condo or an apartment or house and then going into one that has 9 feet, and now people are asking for 10 and 11 feet because you feel better in there. The environment, you feel better in an environment that has proper ventilation and proper filtration. And then the most important thing is natural light. Our engagement with natural light, which is subconscious, is paramount. We actually have a feeling of better well-being when we have natural light or when you're seeing natural light come in through the space. And in fact, waking up to natural light becomes a lot more engaging for your day than it doesn't. And I have all this research to present to you if you'd like. Unfortunately, I can't get into much more detail than that right now.
Okay, so we're going to bring it home here on the return on investment. It all comes down to, the CFO and the investors want to say, okay, if you want to invest into our space, how is it going to return? And I think you've touched on some of the key parts here. There's obviously benefit for the owners and operators to some extent, but it's retention and being able to attract the right renters, to keep them there longer, to differentiate yourself against your competitors. What else would you add to this?
So as I said a second ago, and there's a recent survey, which I can give somebody, I won't look at it right now, that shows that millennials are driving this. Millennials were going into downtown city centers because that's where they wanted to live. Now some of them still want these condo-type environments, but outside of the city. Millennials are driving how we build structures because they're demanding certain things, and one of them is going to be indoor air quality. As I said a second ago, return on investment is as high as 38% for an investment that's going to cost you less than 10%. You want to improve your bottom line? Look at offering a better environment on air, water, and light, rather than saying, hey, look at how good my granite countertop is. For a condo or one space, the cost of something that's visual, meaning a granite countertop, you can do everything else if you put in a cheaper countertop. You can end up putting in a proper ventilation system. You can upgrade your filtration system. You can add that $250 water filter, and you can put in LED lights that have the Amazon or Google or Alexa or whatever that kind of stuff capability to say, go into night shift or go into night mode. You can do all of that and still put in a nice countertop instead of the granite countertop. So you can get a return on investment in building better, or more importantly, building smaller. Whether it's for a capital purchase or whether it's just for rent as well. People will pay more for a better environment, especially when you show them the data how they can live longer and live a better quality of life, or provide a better life for their children, because with children with developing organs and minds, they're a lot more susceptible to these contaminants or these external impacts.
All right, so Nick, thank you. If you can join me in a round of applause for Nick for sharing his
Thank you.
passion around this topic.